So when income goes up, we know that the consumer will be better off because anything that you could purchase without the raise, without the increase in income, she can still purchase after she gets an increase in income, and therefore the constraint that's on her preference on her choice has become weaker or it's been relaxed, and therefore anything that would have made her better off before, you could still do it, and so you can't actually be gaining any kind of welfare from this increase in it. You can't be losing any kind of welfare from this increase in income. We're now going to analyze the slightly more subtle question of whether or not, or what is the change in demand when you change income, right? So we know that whatever the optimal bundle is under the higher income, it makes you better off, but we don't know how the composition of that bundle changes. It could be that you buy more of every good. It could be more that you only buy more of certain goods. It could be that you buy less of some goods. And so we're going to now systematically answer those questions. So initially, it's tempting to assume that dx, di, which is the derivative of the Walrasian demand with respect to income, right? So this is how much of good I do I purchase, what's the change in good I, my demand for good I, when I change my income, right? So this is the ith component of demand. It's change under income. And it's tempting to assume that this thing is weakly positive. So it's either zero or a positive number. The intuition being that if I get a raise, I'm going to buy more of all the things that I'm buying now. I'm going to buy more houseplants. I'm going to buy more T-shirts. I'll buy more, steak dinners. And if by chance something isn't really doing it for me anymore, right? The marginal utility gets small, then I'm not going to buy less, but I'll still buy the same amount. So that means that it's bigger than or equal to zero, this derivative. So this is plausible, but in the model it's not true. It doesn't follow from any of the assumptions. It might be true in certain circumstances, but it's not universally true. There are many situations, both in the model and I think intuitively, when you start to think about it, where this doesn't hold, where your income increases and you buy less of a good. So we're going to break consumption goods into two cases. We're going to call xi, the demand of xi, we're going to call the ith component of demand, xi, normal if the derivative of the demand with respect to income is greater than zero. And we're going to call it inferior if the demand with the derivative of the demand with respect to income is less than zero. So in other words, if you change your income, if you increase your income by a little bit, if you decrease the amount of xi, then it's an inferior good, and if you increase the amount of xi, then it's a normal good. So this is just the definitions. This is just the names that we give to these things. It's kind of interesting. I wonder if you can think of an inferior good, right? So once you see the answer or the type of answer that I'll give you, it becomes kind of obvious, right? But we don't really spend so much time thinking about this, and I think our intuitions are, if you had more money, you'd buy more stuff. So it might pay to take a little second and think, can I think of an inferior good? Welcome back. Here's the answer. So inferior goods, both in our model and also, sort of as an intuitive concept, occur because the consumer would really like to buy expensive things. But when she's poor, she can't afford to buy expensive things, so she substitutes them with cheaper alternatives. And then when her income increases, she moves away from those cheaper alternatives to the more expensive good. So for example, inexpensive food like instant noodles. Although I like instant noodles, not really wealthy either, let's skip that one. Financial services such as payday lending. So these financial services, I don't know if you have this in your socialist utopia in England, but in America, where we really exploit the shit out of poor people, there are things called payday loan companies. And payday loan companies charge ridiculously high interest rates, like 200% or something. You're paying far more than the value of your loan, and it's payday loans because they're very short-term loans. So they'll get you till payday, basically, is the idea. They'll lend you $400 so you can fix your car today, and you have to pay it back, at the end of the month. So they're 2 or 3 week loans or 5-day loans or something, and you pay 200% interest. So you take out this $300, and you're going to have to pay back $600 in 3 days or 5 days. I mean, they're extremely predatory. Some places illegal, but in general, they're fine. They're legal. And the idea is that some people really have no other option, and payday loan places will lend to anyone. People with bad credit, people with no credit. I sound like an infomercial. Bad credit, no credit, whatever. Bankruptcy, we'll still give you money. And so they give these people money, and in exchange for soaking them later. Now, no one in their right mind, if they had another option, would be taking out a payday loan. You go to the bank or you go to your credit card company or something like that, and you take out a small loan, and you pay it back with 8% interest or whatever, right? Interest on a mortgage is 3% or something like this. So if you have access to a different form of credit, you'll surely take it. The point is, people don't often have access because they have bad or no credit. Also because of systematic racism, by the way. Go America. But the larger point here is that if you become wealthier, you might have access to more lines of credit and therefore not want these types of financial services. So when you become wealthier, you're actually going to do less consumption of this particular good. Maybe a more intuitive, or not intuitive, but a more simple example, and one less rife with my philosophizing on the broken country which I come from, are like long distance bus trips, right? So you can take a bus in America from New York to LA. It takes you like 3 or 4 days. I'm sure in Europe you can take a bus around the continent, and it'll take a couple of days to get from whatever, Estonia to Portugal. And maybe you want to see it's scenic and you like it, but for most people, I think that's an inconvenience to take 4 days, what would normally take a 6-hour flight or a 3-hour flight. And so we could think that this is only being taken because you don't have the money to finance a better option. So inferior goods are these goods that I like the general, I want consumption like in that kind of space. I need transportation, I need a financial service, or I need some kind of food. But there's different options, some of which are not so good for my utility, but they're very cheap. Some of them are very good for my utility, but they're expensive. When I become wealthy, I can afford the expensive, better version. When I'm poor, I can only afford the cheaper and less expensive, less utility yielding option. So let's take a look at what that looks like graphically, right? So we could think of our normal good as kind of looking like this. On this graph, we have 3 different budget sets. So we have the budget set I1, income 1, I2, income 2, I3, income 3. All 3 of these face the same prices. How do we know that? Because the slopes of the budget line is the same in all 3 cases. Remember, the slope is related to the vector of prices. I mean, it's not related, it's determined completely by the vector of prices. So the fact that those slopes are the same means this is a problem. All we've done is change the income, we haven't changed prices at all. And we have the maximization of this utility function occurring at each of the 3 points, right? So when the income is lowest at I1, the utility is maximized at the bundle X1, Y1, at I2, X2, Y2, etc. And notice that this line that traces out how much X1 do I consume, how much X do I consume, goes from X1 to X2 to X3. X1 is smaller than X2, X2 is smaller than X3. When I increase income each time, I consume more and more X, good X. And the same thing holds for Y. Y1 is less than Y2, Y2 is less than Y3, and so each time I increase my income, I consume more of good Y. And so that means that both X and Y, at this point in the, these are things that are not global characteristics, right? They depend on the utility function and they depend on the current level of consumption. But at this point, these are both normal goods. They're normal goods because when the income goes up, I consume more of the goods. Now let's look at what an inferior good might look like. Now see, the inferior good doesn't have these really nicely shaped utility functions. They're kind of skewed and smushy on one side. And what happens when we have this smushy thing? Well, here we have the same prices again. The slopes of the 3 budget lines are the same. All we're doing is shifting outwards from I1 to I2 to I3. So we're seeing that you're increasing your utility, your budget each time. And Y is a normal good. Notice that Y1 is less than Y2 is less than Y3. But here, I guess it's Z on the horizontal axis, Z is an inferior good because Z1 is bigger than Z2, is bigger than Z3, which means as I increase my income, I'm actually decreasing my consumption. And why is that? Well, I'm increasing my Y consumption by a lot, right? So I'm increasing my Y consumption by a lot, and I'm decreasing my Z consumption because I want to shift away from it. And you can notice that this inferior goods will always have this pattern where it's very steep in the vertical. The indifference curves are very steep in the Y direction, right? I get a lot of utility from Y. And they're very shallow in the Z direction because I don't get very much utility from Z. And then the ratio of prices is such that as I become wealthier, I really want to shift a lot of consumption into the Y domain, right? Away from Z and towards Y. So Z is like this thing like the bus trips, and Y is plane travel. And it's bus trips don't give me a ton of utility, but they're cheap, and the Ys are the plane travel. They give me more utility, but they're expensive. And so when I have enough money, I'm going to take flights instead of taking buses. All right, so that's all we're going to do for now. We're going to come back to this thought later when we talk about the decomposition of changes in price. But for this lecture, it's good enough to understand there's two kinds of goods, or a good can be of two types, and it depends where you are in the utility space in the domain. So a good can be normal some places and inferior other places, right? I mean, it depends on where you are on the indifference curves. But a normal good is one where you consume more when you get more money, and an inferior good is one you consume less and you get more money.